Many people notice that their mind occasionally jumps to the worst possible outcome of a situation. A small uncertainty appears, and suddenly the brain begins imagining something going wrong. A conversation might turn into conflict. A simple mistake might become a serious problem. A future event might unfold in the most negative way the mind can picture. These thoughts often appear quickly and without warning. Even when there is little evidence that something will actually go wrong, the mind may still explore the possibility. Psychologists have long studied this pattern because it reveals something important about how the brain predicts the future. The human mind is constantly attempting to anticipate what might happen next. To do this, it creates mental simulations of possible outcomes. Some of those simulations are positive, but many involve potential problems. Imagining the worst case is not necessarily a sign that the brain expects disaster. Instead, it reflects how the mind prepares for uncertainty by exploring possibilities before they occur. Prediction is one of the brain's most important functions. Every moment, the mind attempts to estimate what will happen next based on previous experience. This process allows people to react quickly to changes in their environment. Rather than waiting for events to unfold, the brain builds expectations about how situations are likely to develop. These expectations come from patterns stored in memory. If certain events happened in the past, the mind uses those experiences to imagine how similar situations might unfold in the future. Because the future cannot be observed directly, the brain relies on imagination to explore different possibilities. It constructs small mental scenarios and then evaluates them. Some of these scenarios represent positive outcomes. Others represent difficulties or problems that could occur. Imagining the worst case is therefore one way the brain tests whether it is prepared for unexpected events. The mind is not simply predicting disaster. It is exploring possibilities in order to understand how different outcomes might develop. The brain's tendency to imagine negative outcomes is closely related to how attention works. Human attention is naturally drawn toward information that might signal a problem. Throughout human history, recognizing potential danger quickly was extremely important. If the mind noticed a threat too late, the consequences could be serious. Because of this, the brain developed systems that prioritize signals connected to risk or uncertainty. When something unusual appears in the environment, attention often focuses on it immediately. Even small signs of possible difficulty can activate this system. Once attention is drawn to the situation, the mind begins asking what might happen next. The brain then constructs possible scenarios. Some of these scenarios explore how the situation could become worse. This process can make the mind appear overly negative. However, it is actually part of the brain's effort to remain aware of potential problems before they occur. Another reason worst-case scenarios appear so easily is that imagination allows the brain to test situations safely. Instead of waiting for real events to happen, the mind can explore possibilities internally. Through imagination, the brain creates a simulation of how a situation might unfold. Inside the simulation, different outcomes can be examined without any real consequences. The mind might imagine what would happen if a plan failed, if a conversation went badly, or if an unexpected obstacle appeared. By exploring these possibilities mentally, the brain gains information about how the situation could develop. This process helps the mind understand the range of outcomes that might occur. Worst-case scenarios therefore function as one extreme within that range. The brain is not only imagining problems, it is using imagination to examine the boundaries of what could happen in a situation where the future is uncertain. Another reason worst-case thinking appears frequently is the brain's sensitivity to uncertainty. When situations feel predictable, the mind usually remains calm because the next steps seem clear. However, when the future becomes uncertain, the brain begins searching for explanations and possibilities. Uncertainty signals that important information may be missing. To fill that gap, the mind begins constructing possible outcomes. Some of these outcomes are neutral or positive, but others explore what could go wrong. The brain tends to examine these negative possibilities carefully because they represent events that could require quick responses if something unexpected happened in the past. Memory may connect that experience to the current situation. Through this connection, the mind begins imagining how a similar problem might appear again. Worst-case thinking, therefore, often reflects the brain trying to complete an incomplete picture. When the future is unclear, imagination fills the space with scenarios that attempt to explain what might happen next. Memory also plays an important role in how the brain generates worst-case scenarios. The mind stores experiences not only as events, but also as patterns connected to outcomes. When a person remembers a situation that ended badly, the brain may link that memory to new situations that appear similar. Even small similarities can activate this connection. A familiar tone of voice, a particular setting, or a certain type of decision may remind the brain of earlier experiences. Once this connection appears, the mind may begin imagining how the previous outcome could happen again. This does not mean the brain expects the same result. Instead, it reflects the way memory organizes information. Past experiences provide examples of how events can unfold. When the brain encounters uncertainty, it may use those examples as a reference point while imagining possible future outcomes. Worst-case scenarios also reveal how the brain compares different possible futures. When the mind imagines outcomes, it rarely considers only one possibility. Instead, it constructs several scenarios and evaluates how each might unfold. Some possibilities involve ordinary or positive developments. Others explore what could happen if conditions changed in an unfavorable way. Language and internal dialogue often help organize these comparisons. The mind may silently describe one outcome and then question whether another outcome could occur instead. Through this internal discussion, the brain examines multiple directions the future might take. Worst-case thinking appears when the mind focuses strongly on one of the more negative possibilities. However, this scenario is usually only one part of a larger set of imagined outcomes that the brain is evaluating. The speed at which worst-case thoughts appear can also make them seem more convincing. Because the brain quickly detects uncertainty, the first scenario it produces may appear almost instantly. This rapid response is part of how attention systems operate. When the mind senses that something might require careful observation, it attempts to generate an explanation immediately. The first explanation that appears is often a scenario involving possible difficulty. This does not necessarily mean the brain believes the situation will become negative. It simply reflects the speed of the mind's prediction system. Other possibilities may appear afterward, as the brain continues examining the situation. However, the initial scenario often receives the most attention because it appeared first. This timing can give worst-case thoughts a stronger presence in awareness, even when they represent only one possibility among many. Another reason the mind imagines extreme outcomes is the brain's habit of exploring boundaries. When people consider what might happen in the future, the mind often examines the outer limits of possibility. These limits represent the most positive outcome and the most negative outcome the brain can imagine. By considering these extremes, the mind creates a framework for understanding the range of events that might occur. Worst-case thinking, therefore, reflects the brain exploring the far edge of that range. The scenario may appear dramatic or unlikely, but it helps define what the limits of the situation might be. Once those limits are imagined, the brain can better estimate where more realistic outcomes might fall. In this way, extreme scenarios become reference points. They help the mind measure how serious a situation could become, even if the worst possibility never occurs. The brain's prediction system also explains why worst-case thoughts sometimes appear repeatedly. When the mind encounters a situation that remains unresolved, the prediction process may continue returning to it. Each time the brain revisits the situation, it attempts to refine its understanding of what might happen. New details are added to the imagined scenario. The mind may adjust the sequence of events, change how a conversation unfolds, or imagine different reactions from other people. Through this repetition, the brain continues testing how the situation might develop. The repeated appearance of worst-case scenarios can therefore reflect ongoing analysis rather than expectation. The mind is repeatedly examining the same uncertainty from different angles, searching for patterns that might clarify how the situation could unfold. Internal dialogue often accompanies worst-case thinking because language helps organize imagined events. When the brain constructs a scenario, it frequently describes the situation in silent sentences. The mind may explain what could happen, question why it might occur, or imagine how someone might respond. These sentences create a structured narrative. Instead of a vague sense of worry, the situation becomes a detailed story about how events might unfold. Language allows the brain to explore the sequence step by step. Each sentence adds another part of the imagined event. Through this process, internal dialogue transforms uncertainty into a scenario that the mind can examine more clearly. Worst-case thinking, therefore, often appears as a story the brain tells itself while trying to understand an uncertain future. Another important factor behind worst-case thinking is how attention remains focused on unresolved situations. When the brain encounters something that feels incomplete or uncertain, it often continues examining it in the background. Even when attention shifts to other tasks, the mind may quietly return to the unresolved event. During these moments, the brain continues constructing possible explanations and outcomes. Worst-case scenarios can appear during this ongoing analysis. They represent one possible explanation for how the uncertainty might be resolved. As long as the situation remains unclear, the mind may continue exploring different possibilities. The appearance of negative scenarios, therefore, reflects the brain's effort to complete an unfinished understanding of the situation. The mind keeps examining the uncertainty until it gathers enough information to form a clearer interpretation. Worst-case scenarios also reveal how strongly the brain relies on imagination to understand the future. Unlike memory, which deals with events that have already happened, prediction requires the mind to create situations that do not yet exist. To do this, the brain combines fragments of past experience with present information. A conversation from yesterday, a decision made earlier in the day, or a memory from years ago may all contribute small pieces to an imagined future event. When these pieces combine, the mind forms a possible scenario. Some of these scenarios describe ordinary outcomes, but others explore what could happen if conditions changed in an unfavorable way. Worst-case thinking often appears when the brain arranges these fragments into a story that emphasizes potential difficulty. However, the process itself reflects how imagination helps the mind build models of events that have not yet occurred. Another reason worst-case scenarios appear so vivid is the brain's ability to simulate experiences internally. When the mind imagines a situation, many of the same mental systems involved in real perception become active. The brain may picture the setting, imagine the sound of a voice, or silently describe the unfolding event. Because these details resemble real experience, the imagined scenario can feel convincing. The mind briefly treats the situation as if it were actually occurring. This simulation helps the brain explore how events might develop without needing to encounter them directly. Worst-case scenarios therefore feel powerful, partly because they are experienced as detailed mental simulations rather than simple abstract ideas. The brain uses these simulations to test how different situations might unfold. Worst-case thinking also becomes more noticeable when the brain attempts to protect important goals. When people care deeply about an outcome, the mind becomes highly attentive to anything that might interfere with that result. A student preparing for an important exam, a person planning a conversation, or someone making a major decision may all experience this pattern. The brain begins examining possible obstacles that could prevent the goal from being achieved. Some of these imagined obstacles may represent realistic challenges, while others may be more extreme possibilities. Worst-case scenarios often appear among these imagined outcomes because they represent situations where the goal might fail completely. By examining these possibilities, the mind attempts to understand the full range of events that could influence the outcome. Worst-case thinking, therefore, often reflects the brain focusing intensely on protecting something that feels important. Perspective also influences how strongly worst-case scenarios appear in awareness. During moments when the mind is actively engaged with the situation, attention becomes focused on specific details. A small uncertainty may begin to dominate the entire interpretation of the event. From this narrow perspective, the imagined scenario may seem more significant than it actually is. Later, when attention shifts or more information becomes available, the situation may appear very different. The brain may recognize that other outcomes were always possible. Worst-case thinking, therefore, often reflects a temporary narrowing of attention around uncertainty. When the mind focuses intensely on a single possibility, that scenario can appear larger than the surrounding context. As attention expands again, the brain usually begins considering a wider range of possible outcomes. Another feature of worst-case thinking is how the brain gradually adjusts imagined scenarios over time. When the mind first encounters uncertainty, the initial scenario may appear quickly and with very little detail. This first version often represents a rough prediction based on limited information. As the brain continues examining the situation, the scenario may change. New details appear, the sequence of events shifts, and the mind begins refining its interpretation of what might happen. Through this process, the imagined outcome evolves. The brain compares the original scenario with additional information gathered from memory, observation, and reasoning. Worst-case thinking, therefore, does not always remain fixed. It often changes as the mind gathers more information about the situation. This gradual adjustment reflects the brain's effort to update its predictions as new understanding develops. Worst-case scenarios also reveal how closely thinking and storytelling are connected. When the brain imagines possible events, it often arranges them into a narrative. A beginning appears where the situation starts, followed by a sequence of actions and reactions that move the story forward. This narrative structure helps the mind understand how events might develop across time. Instead of isolated ideas, the imagined situation becomes a chain of connected moments. Worst-case thinking, therefore, often appears as a detailed story about how events might unfold. The mind describes what might happen first, what might follow afterward, and how the situation could ultimately end. By constructing the scenario as a story, the brain can explore the entire sequence of possible events, rather than focusing on a single moment of uncertainty. Another reason worst-case scenarios feel powerful is that the brain tends to remember negative outcomes more vividly than neutral ones. Experiences that involve strong consequences often leave clearer impressions in memory. Because these memories remain vivid, they may appear more quickly when the brain searches for examples of what could happen in the future. When the mind encounters uncertainty, it may recall situations where events developed in difficult or unexpected ways. These memories provide material for imagined scenarios. The brain may adapt the earlier experience and apply it to the present situation. Worst-case thinking, therefore, sometimes reflects the mind drawing from memories that carry strong emotional meaning. These memories act as examples that help the brain imagine how events might unfold under unfavorable conditions. The environment in which thoughts appear can also influence how strongly worst-case scenarios are noticed. These thoughts often emerge during quiet moments when the mind is not focused on immediate tasks. Activities such as resting, walking, or traveling allow attention to move more freely between ideas. During these moments, the brain may return to situations that remain uncertain. Without external distractions, imagination becomes more active. the mind begins exploring possible explanations and outcomes. Worst-case scenarios may appear within this reflective state because the brain is examining unanswered questions. The absence of new information allows imagination to fill the space. As a result, the mind constructs detailed possibilities while attempting to understand what the future might bring. From a psychological perspective, worst-case thinking reveals how actively the brain studies uncertain situations. The mind rarely waits passively for events to unfold. Instead, it constantly builds predictions based on memory, observation, and imagination. When uncertainty appears, this predictive system becomes especially active. The brain begins constructing multiple scenarios to explore how the situation might develop. Worst-case scenarios represent one part of this larger process. They appear when the mind examines the possibility that events could move in an unfavorable direction. Although these scenarios may feel dramatic, they reflect the brain's effort to understand uncertainty rather than a simple expectation of disaster. Worst-case thinking, therefore, provides insight into how the mind studies possibilities before the future arrives. When viewed from a broader perspective, the brain imagining worst-case scenarios becomes easier to understand. The mind is constantly attempting to anticipate what might happen next. To do this, it constructs many possible futures and compares how each might unfold. Some scenarios describe ordinary outcomes, while others explore situations where events develop in unexpected or difficult ways. Worst-case thinking represents the mind examining the extreme end of that range. By imagining what could go wrong, the brain defines the boundaries of what might occur. This exploration helps the mind interpret uncertainty and consider how different events might influence the future. What appears as negative thinking is often part of the brain's larger effort to understand possibilities. Worst-case scenarios therefore reveal how imagination, memory, and prediction combine as the mind attempts to interpret an uncertain world.